The .2 releases of Empire War Expanded across all of our projects are going to involve some pretty broad changes to build upon prior reworks. This includes additional reworks on the galactic level, in ground tactical combat, and in space as well. In this video, we're going to go over one of the first areas which has seen some pretty significant changes since .1, bombers and anti-fighter ships along with carriers. Although none of it was included in the .1 releases, these are some changes which started months ago before we even released .1, and represent some pretty big shifts in how a lot of things will work. With the initial space reworks that took place in 2.3.6 and some of the smaller reworks which followed, space combat as a whole ended up in a much better place, especially with how ships of different size classes were able to relate to each other. One area that's remained somewhat more controversial or problematic is the role of bombers and fighters in the mod. There were a couple problems with how they currently play. While they were able to provide a lot of damage over longer periods of time, generally without the same answers that other ships had unless there were several anti-fighter corvettes around, the timescale they would do this on tended to not be as impactful for the usual duration of battles in Empire War Expanded, and often the numbers you'd see in battles contributed to tactical lag when they were being impactful. Generally, they were quite good at stripping shields of large ships when you had reasonable numbers of them, but it was hard to use them directly against hulls, how many players would expect them to work. Overall, while heavy fighter micro could get higher damage output from large swarms of them, especially using bomber-heavy ships like Nebulon Bs, this often felt more like getting into the direction of cheese territory than something you could reasonably accomplish with reasonable carrier-focused fleets without getting into laggy territory with the numbers. In most cases, it just ended up meaning that fighter micro was not really worth the benefits you'd get out of it and was really more of a chore and not especially fun. That's the main issue. Finally, the way carrier loadouts were structured often made it hard to get a fleet built up where bombers were your primary damage tool if that's what you wanted to do, which is kind of problematic when certain factions should ideally be using that relatively heavily. You can easily structure a fleet around any other size class providing your damage depending on faction, but that's very difficult to do with bombers unless again you're focusing just on building something like a ton of Nebulon Bs that only put out a Y-Wing squad. So these reworks were aimed at a few key points. One was to make bombers just generally more fun to use and have their impacts be more visually clear. The second was making sure bombers could operate effectively against hard points directly. The third was making fighter loadouts more consistent and making it clear what you had to do if you wanted a bomber-focused fleet. Fourth was to reduce the overall numbers of fighters and bombers in battles while increasing their possible output, since they were a primary factor in causing both lag and cluttered screen space. Finally, we wanted to make sure there were reasonable ways to limit the impact of fighters and bombers that felt consistent, fair, and fun to play around, which would help make sure that fighters and bombers could be fun themselves, but they'd also not just take over the game, even if you could properly build around them. We don't want fighters and bombers to be the answer to every problem. This allows us to build different factions around different strengths without fighter and bomber focused faction being clearly favored in every situation. There are some more broad weapon effect changes coming in the .2 updates, which we'll talk about in the future, but rather than just bump up the numbers on bombers' proton torpedoes, which would have a larger implication for other proton ships as well as fighters, we wanted to carve out a niche for bombers both in their impact visually and in how you use them. So while things like fighters and skip ray blast boats are keeping standard proton torpedoes, dedicated bombers have been moved mostly over to two new projectile types, proton rockets and proton bombs. For most bombers, this means they'll have both and both do different things. The rockets share their damage type with proton torpedoes, damage types being the thing in Empire at War, which determines whether a specific weapon type will do more or less damage to a specific target type. For example, a corvette, a capital ship, a super ship, on top of the regular damage amount. So you can have different damage values for a projectile, but then they also have a damage type, which applies different amount of damage modifiers depending on the shield or armor type that they're hitting. Proton bombs receive a new damage type, which does decrease damage against smaller ships, but even more against larger ones, keeping bombers mostly focused on hitting larger targets. Rockets are fired from farther away than bombs, which means you can tell bombers to attack, let them fire off their rockets and still do a good amount of damage, but then you can also choose to micro them away before they're close enough to drop their bombs and keep them safer, or you can let them go in and drop their whole payload. There were some additional changes in the .1 releases where we reduced anti-bomber accuracy for most heavy weapon hardpoints, which really did help them become more survivable already, and I think people have already kind of seen an impact from that, but this is still something that you can kind of do to choose whether you want to play a bit more risky with them, or just kind of go in and risk them getting attacked a bit more. Additionally, while proton rockets do single target damage, proton bombs do an area of effect damage, making them inherently better against larger hardpoint saturated ships than smaller ones without targetable hardpoints. So, for example, the hardpoint clusters of 3 on the Praetor are going to typically be in danger of being hit by the same projectile. While there is some per bomber increase in anti-shield damage, especially with the reduction in overall numbers of fighters and bombers, which helps make them a lot easier to command, one of the primary focuses with the damage changes was the anti-hull aspect. Generally, the goal was to make sure any reasonable, nearly full bomber squad, so nothing that's just intended to be weaker than other bombers, could reliably take down hardpoints without as much hoping that you have enough bombers alive in it to do a reasonable amount of damage. Because of the high recharge rates on bombers, or high reload times rather, it could sometimes be frustrating to tell them attack a hardpoint, and they'd be going for about 30 seconds, and maybe they'd get one bombing run off, but then it wouldn't do quite as much damage because a bunch of them have been destroyed. It'll be a bit more clear what you can expect out of them now. Usually before, you'd end up just having another ship come in and finish off whatever hard points, and then sending the bombers off to strip the shields on something else as a group. As ever, the specific reload times for these weapons will vary by bomber type. Some, like the K-Wings, have a 12.5 second reload timers, others get up to 30, so the K-Wing being essentially the best bomber in the game. The goal is to move bombers into fulfilling their vision as large bursts of damage with a higher downtime, and making it clear when they should be used versus kept away, which we'll get into in a second. We're especially trying to emphasize their strengths against the super large battle cruisers or super star destroyers. Next up, we have the reworks to fighter complements. While generally per-ship fighter loadouts and current versus reserve fighters haven't changed a whole lot over the last space reworks, changes to pop cap, additional fighter spawns for some ships that didn't used to have them, and some other adjustments to survivability have usually led to a higher average number of fighters and bombers in battle at once. This was a primary cause of lag for some players, and the way that fighters and bombers and interceptors were distributed was fairly similar everywhere, so there weren't as many clear options to have bomber-oriented damage. You could largely get a fleet of carriers like Quasars, or a fleet of larger capitals that also happen to have fighters, and you'd get a similar distribution of fighters versus bombers versus interceptors. These bomber changes have included a complete restructuring of how we assign bombers and fighters to ships. Bombers are now heavily favored by dedicated carriers, having half bombers and half fighters, sometimes a bit more than half. For other ships that aren't designated as carriers, they're generally more split between designated fighters and interceptors. So if you're building a lot of carriers, you'll have a lot of bombers. If you don't build any carriers, you'll generally have very few bombers, sometimes none. The bomber role is now very clearly marked by which bombers use the proton rockets and bombs, rather than including things like the split fighter bomber role. Those things like ARC 170s and other fighter bombers which had proton torpedo access before are keeping that proton torpedo access. And for those to count as solely fighters for loadout purposes, that allows us to give certain factions which are more fighter focused and which do have those types of fighter bomber mixes like the New Republic and the Republic, that allows them to have a bit more of a fighter and bomber focus with their anti-ship damage through those proton torpedoes without overly skewing them towards dedicated bombers. In all cases, there was an attempt to cut down the number of fighters that are going to be on the battle map at any given time, though carriers were not included in the reduction directly. Because bombers have had such an increase in damage, the population value of ships which carry them will generally see an increase, which helps reduce the total value as well. Having them all scaled this way should help with both lag and making everything feel a lot more manageable when you're trying to micro your fighters and your carriers and all the other stuff. As with anything else, the exact numbers and all this will continue to shift and be tweaked to accomplish kind of the goals that we've outlined, but we wanted to give an idea of what the thought process is behind these changes and the principles we're working towards there. That covers the basics of the changes to the bombers themselves, but there are two other changes in the works which are designed to help make sure that the power around bombers isn't as free as it can sometimes be in Empire at War. In the persistent damage for super ships video, we spoke about how a major problem in Empire at War there was that you could nearly lose a super ship, and then the next battle, if it had one hard point left, it's going to be back up to full, and how we've added persistent damage to counteract that. Carrier fleets can often feel like they're in a similar situation, where you drop some carriers, send in the fighters and bombers, and if you spam enough, even if you lose every single fighter and bomber, you just get them back for free next battle, allowing you to immediately move on. Now when a squadron dies, there will be an actual cost associated with that, but more on that in the future. Finally, we have some additional changes as part of our weapon reworks, which we talked about a little bit with the bombers themselves, but which is actually part of a broader set of mod-wide changes trying to add some more specific effects to different weapon types. We want to help clarify for players that they're not just using units as a collection of different amounts of DPS, with each unit just being a samey collection of damage or health. The armor and damage type matrix does actually differentiate things quite a bit, but we wanted some more impactful, immediately understandable effects from the player perspective of why you would use one weapon versus another on a ship. And so there are a few changes being made in that direction. For today's purposes, we're going to be talking about what lasers do. For most ships with laser cannons, currently restricted to ships which are smaller than our size cutoff for targetable hardpoints, so about 450 meters, we've given them passive point defense abilities to intercept incoming physical munitions, similar to the ability that the Crusader had in the base game, but less intense and passive, so it's always on. The amount of projectiles it's able to intercept is based on how many cannons it has, so there is some deep math behind all of that. Basically, this means when you're concerned about physical weapons, spending more on ships with lasers to protect your heavy hitters is preferable. Physical munitions will generally be getting the AoE damage mentioned with the bombs, so it's not going to be quite like the Diamond Borons in the base game murdering everything, but it'll be different than just getting attacked with regular turbo lasers. Of course, with all of this, it's all still in progress and plans can change at any time. So for heavily laser-focused ships like dedicated anti-fighter ships, on top of being able to kill the fighters and bombers, they're able to directly protect capital ships by negating some of the damage output from ships with physical munitions like bombers and even some of the larger assault conch type stuff. Each of these ships basically has two abilities for this, one aimed more at the smaller munitions coming from things like bombers, and then one ability which takes out fewer projectiles aimed at the kind of larger assault conchs you'd see from the Invincible or the VSD-1. The ability of each ship to negate each type of damage depends on the specific type of weapon that they have. This should add a lot of depth to how you want to load out your fleets and whether you're going to be going for anti-fighter ships before trying to assault the main capital ships or even some of the other smaller frigates with lasers. If you try to just go for the biggest targets first, you may have a lot of anti-fighter ships or lasers around that are going to be helping to negate some of your damage if you're indexing heavily into physical weaponry. Heavy lasers are going to be worse at intercepting smaller bombs but better at intercepting heavy weapons and vice versa. That does it for our broader overview of the bomber changes and the carrier changes. If you'd like to see some of this in action, there should be some inclusion of it in some of the upcoming preview playthroughs, but it should help make one of the aspects of the mod that was a bit less fun to use feel a lot more engaging going into the future.